I'm Elizabeth Harrington, 55 years old, a four-star general in the United States Army. I've carried this uniform across continents, through wars and negotiations, but today, the heaviest battles are fought at home. In my family, honor was a currency. My father demanded it, my mother held it quietly, and my younger brother David craved it like air. He grew up in my shadow. Every medal I earned only deepened the silence around his own struggles. The more I rose, the more he turned away. Now, he stands ready to accept his promotion to colonel. A ceremony filled with applause, cameras, and pride. And yet my name is nowhere on the guest list. No call, no invitation. My own brother has chosen to erase me. Ever been cut out of your own family's story? Hit like if you've ever been pushed aside. And comment if you know what it feels like to be forgotten on purpose. It started in Arlington this morning. I stood before the mirror in my apartment, the blinds cutting pale ribbons of light across my pressed uniform. My hand hovered over the jacket for a moment before resting on the fabric, part reverence, part fatigue. I had worn it across continents, but today it felt heavier than any battlefield gear. Liz stood before the mirror in her Arlington apartment, the morning light slipping through the blinds in muted ribbons across her pressed uniform. Every medal, every ribbon of service she had earned, gleamed as if demanding recognition in the silence. Her hand hovered over the jacket for a moment, then rested on the fabric with something between reverence and fatigue. She had worn this uniform across continents, through campaigns that tested her resolve, but this morning it felt heavier than any battlefield gear. Somewhere in the reflection of her own eyes, she saw the cold stare of her brother David's eyes that had once looked up to her in awe, now fixed on her with the cutting detachment of rivalry that had hardened since they were children. That memory, sharper than steel, slid through her mind, reminding her that the ceremony awaiting him was also a quiet repudiation of her place in the family. The apartment was silent, except for the soft tick of a clock on the wall. The smell of fresh coffee lingered faintly. Her father, Richard Harrington, had insisted on brewing a pot, though he hadn't touched his cup. He sat stiffly in a chair near the window, his aged frame still holding a soldier's posture even in his late 70s. His voice broke the silence, tinged with both pride and hesitation. "Your brother's going to make colonel today," he said, almost as if testing the words. "It's a proud day for the Harrington name." Liz nodded, her hands working carefully at a metal clasp, her face composed, but her chest tightening with every syllable. The words were meant as celebration, but to her they carried an undertone she could not ignore, an echo that she had already heard in the absence of an invitation. She had not received a letter, a call, not even a message. Her own flesh and blood, her younger brother, had chosen to step into the spotlight of recognition while deliberately closing the door on her. It was a silence louder than any insult. "I didn't get an invitation," she murmured, her voice low, nearly drowned by the hum of traffic outside. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his weathered hands clasping the cane at his side. "I'm sure it was an oversight," he tried, but his eyes betrayed what his mouth refused to say. There was no oversight. David's disdain had been deliberate, sharp as a blade, and just as personal. Liz let out a breath, focusing on the mirror again. Her achievements were listed in framed commendations on the wall behind her: deployments, operations, commands. She had led men and women in war, commanded fleets, and negotiated crises that had kept lives safe. Yet here, in the one arena that should have been home, her very existence was being erased. The invisible wound gaped wider, her family's silence as potent as any betrayal. She adjusted the cap on her head, tilting it until it sat with precision. Her reflection seemed to answer back. Strength layered over fragility, defiance over pain. "If he wants me gone, he should have the courage to tell me to my face," she whispered, though her father said nothing. His silence was its own commentary, a concession to the divide he could not mend. As she prepared, her thoughts spiraled through fragments of memory. David as a boy, marching toy soldiers across the floor, looking up at her in admiration. David as a cadet, shoulders square, his gaze already sharpening into competition. David in recent years, withholding warmth, turning family gatherings into unspoken contests of loyalty. Somewhere in those years, admiration had calcified into envy, and envy into rejection. Richard's voice cracked softly. "You don't have to go, Liz, if it hurts too much," she straightened, cutting him off with a calm steadiness. "No, father, if I don't go, then I accept being erased. That's not who I am." Her hand slipped into a drawer and emerged with a small, worn box. Inside lay a silver challenge coin engraved with an eagle, something she had once given David during his early service. She closed her hand around it, a souvenir of trust that he had long since abandoned, but she would carry today nonetheless. The apartment seemed to hold its breath as she gathered her things. The medals, the coin, the years of service that could not be erased by silence. The faint weight of grief pressed on her, yet beneath it burned a steadier flame, the refusal to vanish. Walking out of the apartment, Liz's eyes were determined. If they want to erase my name, they will have to face the truth. Flashback. Childhood in a harsh military family. The smell of cut grass and the sting of summer heat were constants in the Harrington household at Quantico. Their backyard wasn't a place of leisure, but of drills. Obstacles cobbled together from wooden planks and ropes stood like monuments to their father's unrelenting creed. Liz, at 16, already bore the posture of a soldier. Her ponytail snapped behind her as she vaulted a low wall with practiced ease, boots pounding the dirt with precision. David trailed behind 2 years younger, determined, his breath ragged but his eyes ablaze with effort. Richard Harrington watched from the porch, his figure stiff against the morning sun. His uniform had long been retired, but the aura of command never left him. "Faster, David," he barked. "You'll never catch her like that." The words cut through the boy like shards of glass. He pushed harder, nearly stumbling, but Liz was already clearing the next obstacle, her movement fluid, efficient, almost effortless. It wasn't that she sought to humiliate him. Excellence had become her nature, forged under the same pressure that pressed on him. Yet the difference in how their father saw them was unmistakable. When Liz reached the finish, Richard allowed the faintest nod of approval, pride shadowing his stern features. David arrived seconds later, chest heaving, sweat streaking his forehead. Instead of encouragement, he was met with silence, a silence that weighed more than rebuke. "Honor is only worth it if you keep it," Richard intoned, his gaze fixed on Liz, not on the son who craved his recognition. David's jaw tightened. Liz glanced at her brother, her smile meant to be reassuring, but it landed as pity. That look lodged deeper in him than any defeat. Years passed in that same rhythm. High school debates, track races, tactical drills, and JROTC. Liz won, David lost. The ledger of victories was lopsided, but the shadow of their father's expectations made each loss unbearable. Richard's pride in Liz became a burden David could not lift. At night, she sometimes overheard muffled grunts from his room, the sound of him training alone, punishing his body in secret as though each push-up might erase the humiliation of trailing her. The resentment fermented slowly, invisibly. A scraped knee here, a mocking glance from other cadets there, it all fed the fire. Liz wanted to believe he would grow out of it, that the bond of blood would outweigh the bitterness of rivalry. Yet the glances he cast at her sharpened with each year, narrowing into blades. One evening, after another failed attempt to outpace her in a sprint through the woods, David collapsed against a tree, sweat pouring down his face. She reached out a hand to pull him up. He refused it, his eyes burning in the dimming light. "One day," he whispered, breathless but fierce, "you will have to bow down to me." The venom in his tone startled her. For the first time, she saw not just frustration, but a hunger, a need to reverse their roles at any cost. That vow lingered in the air long after the cicadas fell silent. It would become the seed of the betrayal now blooming. Back in the present, Liz's reflection caught in the glass of the bus stop shelter outside Fort Liberty. The echoes of their rivalry pressed against her chest like a bruise that had never healed. Her lips moved, quiet but firm, the words meant only for herself. "That day has come, but not as I thought." Marcus Denton appears, the conservative general who was pulling the strings behind David's back. The lamp on Marcus Denton's mahogany desk cast a muted glow, stretching long shadows against the paneled walls of his private office. Framed photos of him with former administration's handshakes, medals, stiff smiles lined the shelves. His reputation was carved from decades of resisting change, resisting people like Liz Harrington. For him, tradition was not just policy, it was survival. Tonight, the air reeked of cigar smoke and ambition. David Harrington stood by the window, staring at the city lights that glittered beyond the base. His hands were buried deep in his pockets, shoulders tense, the weight of the coming ceremony pressing into his spine. He had spent years clawing for this promotion, yet his sister's shadow loomed even here. Denton knew it. He had been studying David for months, waiting for this exact crack in his armor. "Tomorrow is not your sister's day," Denton said calmly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. His voice carried both reassurance and command. "This is your chance to shine, to step out of her shadow once and for all." David turned, eyes uncertain. She's still family. She outranks me, ignoring that could backfire. Denton's smile was thin, rehearsed. Outranks you? She is a symbol of reforms that would gut the old guard, strip us of everything we built. You want your career to mean something? Then you have to decide if you'll be remembered as Liz Harrington's brother or as Colonel David Harrington, standing on his own merit. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Cut her off the list. Make this room yours. David hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He could still hear their father's voice praising Liz, still feel the sting of being second, always second. His hand brushed the folder Denton had slid across the desk, an updated guest list for the ceremony. At the bottom was the blank space where her name should have been. General, this feels, he faltered. It feels wrong. Wrong? Denton set down his glass with a sharp clink. What's wrong is letting her steal the spotlight again. What's wrong is allowing her presence to overshadow the moment you've earned. Do you think she would hesitate if the roles were reversed? No, son. She would seize the stage. He pushed the pen across the desk. Sign it. History rewards the bold. David's jaw tightened, his pulse quickening. He looked at the document, then at Denton, whose eyes glinted like steel. A storm of hatred and guilt swirled in his chest. He thought of the promise he'd made as a teenager, the vow that one day Liz would bow before him. This was the first step. His hand trembled as he lifted the pen. The scratch of ink on paper sounded like betrayal itself. Denton watched, satisfied, a predator scenting victory. Good, he murmured, leaning back. Tomorrow, she will not exist in that room. Tomorrow is yours. David nodded stiffly, but when the ink dried, an emptiness gnawed at him. He drifted toward the mirror hanging by the office door. The reflection that stared back was unfamiliar, his own eyes wide, caught between pride and fear. For the first time, he saw the makings of the man he wanted to be and the cracks of the man he might become. He stood there longer than he meant to, staring into the trembling truth of his own gaze. Liz calls Kate O'Neill, a close ally, for another way in. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic drifting in through the half-open window. Liz sat at her dining table, the overhead light pooling across the surface where her uniform lay carefully spread. She had unbuttoned it, letting the fabric breathe as if the cloth itself carried the weight of 4 stars and decades of sacrifice. Each metal gleamed under her polishing cloth, reflections sparking against her fingers. She worked slowly, deliberately, treating every mark of honor as if it were part of her skin. Tomorrow, she would stand where she did not belong, or so they thought. The phone buzzed once, then again. Liz lifted it and pressed it to her ear. Kate, she said softly, relief breaking through the steel of her voice. On the other end, Kate O'Neill's voice was steady, like a wire pulled tight. Liz, I heard what they're doing. David's name is everywhere in the announcements, but yours, it's as if you never existed. They think they can write you out. Liz's throat tightened. She closed her eyes and leaned back against the chair. They left me off the list. My own brother. Denton's hands are all over it. But I can't sit back, Kate. Not after everything. Kate hesitated, then her tone sharpened. Do you remember what your mother wrote in her will? Never let anyone take away your honor. Those words weren't just for comfort. They were instructions. You can't let them erase you. The memory struck Liz hard. She could still see her mother's handwriting, faded ink on yellowed paper, the words curling at the edges from years of being folded and unfolded. Her mother had been the quiet anchor in a house of soldiers, the only one who understood that honor wasn't given by rank but by the truth one carried. Liz opened her eyes and looked at the uniform again. If I walk in there as a guest, they'll treat me like one. I can't do that. I have to enter as who I am, a general. Not his sister, not his shadow, a general. Kate's chuckle was soft but resolute. Then that's what you'll do. You'll enter as a general, Liz. Not as someone begging for a seat. You'll claim what's yours. The night pressed heavy around them, but inside, Liz's resolve began to harden. She stood, lifting each medal, pinning it back onto the fabric with careful precision. One by one, the ribbons lined her chest again, each representing battles fought, sacrifices endured, lives changed. The silence of the room only deepened the sound of her breathing, steady, determined. Her gaze fell to a small wooden box on the shelf. She opened it gently, revealing her mother's relics. A silver locket with the initials etched faintly, a folded handkerchief carrying the scent of lavender long faded, and a journal filled with quiet prayers and lessons. Liz touched the locket, her fingers lingering on the cool metal. Tomorrow, she thought, I will confront them head on, not with rage but with presence, with the truth they fear most. She dressed slowly, the weight of the uniform wrapping her shoulders like armor. The stars on her collar caught the light, fierce and undeniable. She walked to the mirror and studied the woman staring back. For years she had borne wounds invisible to others' dismissals, whispers, outright betrayal. Now those wounds glinted as steel in her eyes. The phone was still in her hand. She pressed a number she had memorized years ago. The line clicked, and Sam Carter's familiar voice answered. "Sam?" Liz said, her voice unwavering now, each syllable etched with finality. "Tomorrow, I need another door to enter." The band sounds. The official promotion ceremony begins, but Liz is not on the guest list. The brass instruments cut through the cavernous Great Hall at Fort Liberty, their notes echoing against banners and polished stone. The air was charged, thick with pride and expectation. Officers in full dress stood in straight rows, their medals glittering beneath chandeliers. Families crowded into the seats, snapping photos, whispering in admiration, clapping in practiced rhythm. At the front, the stage glowed with a spotlight that fell squarely on Colonel to be David Harrington. His smile was carved sharp, precise, every inch the son they had chosen to celebrate. Liz's chest tightened at the sound of the music. The humiliation from the gate replayed like a bruise pressed too hard. She could still hear the young lieutenant's hesitant voice. "Sorry, your name is not on the list, General." The sting had not faded, it deepened now. Watching from the shadows at the back entrance Sam Carter had secured for her, she moved slowly, careful not to draw attention, the heavy weight of her 4 stars burning against her collar like an unspoken truth. On stage, David raised his hands for silence. "Today," he declared, his voice amplified across the room, "is not just my day. It is the day of every soldier in my unit. We have fought, we have endured, and now we rise together." The applause was immediate, thunderous, drowning out the fact that one soldier, one sister, had been erased. Richard Harrington sat near the front row, his posture stiff, hands clasped tight against his cane. Pride shimmered in his eyes, but beneath it, a trace of unease flickered. He had raised 2 children in uniforms, 2 branches of the same tree, yet only one stood on that stage. His gaze swept the room, searching unconsciously for Liz. At the far side, Marcus Denton leaned into the aisle, his jaw firm, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. He barely clapped, offering only a shallow nod at David's words. For him, this was not a celebration, it was a maneuver. He wanted David visible, Liz erased, and the story rewritten. Liz pressed herself against the cool wall near the entrance, her breaths even but heavy. She could feel the pomp of the ceremony pressing in, the cheers, the adoration, the cameras. None of it touched her. Her silence was her weapon, her presence unseen yet undeniable. Every step she took closer to the hall was a quiet rebellion against the forces that had cast her out. The speech continued, David's words measured, his voice carrying the weight of ambition more than sincerity. He glanced toward the crowd, his eyes scanning, and for one instant they caught her. Liz stood near a column, half in shadow, but unmistakable in her uniform. His smile faltered, a flash of confusion breaking through the mask. His grip on the podium tightened. Liz didn't move, didn't blink. She let him see her. The sister he had excluded. The general he could not erase. David looked away almost instantly, forcing the smile back, his voice pitched higher to cover the slip. He spoke of unity, of honor, of sacrifice, but his throat was tight, and the words rang hollow to those who truly listened. Beside him, Denton leaned closer, his lips brushing David's ear, his voice low and cold. "Let's make the whole hall believe that she is just the past." The band swelled again. The crowd rose in applause, and Liz stood motionless in the shadows, silent but unyielding. David suddenly mentions his sister in the middle of his speech, but not to glorify her. The hall grew quiet again as David leaned into the microphone, his polished boots glinting beneath the stage lights. His posture radiated confidence, his chest puffed with the kind of pride that seemed almost rehearsed. Every officer sat upright, every civilian leaned forward, their attention drawn completely to him. The band had just finished its triumphant note, and now it was his voice that carried across the great hall, heavy and commanding. He began to weave his story, his career journey told with a cadence that drew admiration. He spoke of deployments, late nights, sacrifices he had endured. Each pause was deliberate, each word sharpened to impress the commanders in the front row. His voice grew more assured as he measured out the narrative of his rise. But then, his tone shifted. "There were times," he said, letting his gaze sweep across the hall, "when others thought they could define my path, when they believed their shadow would always hang over me. Some even thought honor could be handed down by title or bestowed by the stars pinned on a collar." He stopped, savoring the silence that followed. His lips curled almost imperceptibly into a smirk. "But I've learned honor is not inherited. It is not a gift. It is proven on the battlefield, by courage, by resilience, by standing with your men and never faltering." The words sliced through Liz like glass. She was hidden in the shadows near the back, her uniform crisp, her eyes locked on her brother. The medal she carried, a token she had planned to give him, dug into her palm as her fingers curled around it. His voice was not just proud, it was mocking, laced with years of resentment that finally found an audience. The hall erupted in applause. Officers clapped with solemn respect. Families smiled, proud of a speech they believed was about noble sacrifice. None of them realized the sting embedded in his words. None of them knew he had just twisted the blade into his sister, dismissing her decades of service as if they were hollow, as if her stars meant nothing but a symbol of favoritism. Liz's jaw tightened, her breath slow and controlled, though her chest burned. Every clap, every cheer around her felt like a chorus of betrayal. She had bled for the same flag that now hung behind David. She had led soldiers through chaos. She had carried the weight of decisions he had never even been close to. Yet here he stood, telling the world that her honor was unearned. For a moment, her father's words echoed in her mind. Words spoken when she was barely out of her teens. "Honor is only worth it if you keep it." She had lived by that, carried it into every battle. But David had warped it, had used it as a weapon against her in front of the very men and women she had once commanded. Her knuckles whitened around the metal, the edges biting into her skin. Her eyes were icy, fixed on him. She didn't shift, didn't move to interrupt. This was his stage, his day, and he had chosen to stain it with venom. Fine. She would answer in her own time, and the hall would remember her silence as the calm before the storm. David lifted his chin, letting the applause wash over him like validation. He didn't dare glance toward the shadows where he had seen her earlier. He knew she was there. He knew she heard. That made the moment sweeter for him, crueler for her. In the dim light near the back row, Liz's phone vibrated softly. She slipped it from her pocket, her pulse still steady despite the rage burning under her skin. A message glowed on the screen. Kate's words were short, sharp, urgent. "It's time. This whole room needs to see the truth." Liz steps out of the dark corner, silently walking towards the altar. The music still rolled through the great hall, a polished hymn to victory and pride. But for Liz, every note was muffled, distant, as if the world had slowed into something unreal. She moved forward from the shadows, her polished boots striking the marble floor with a rhythm that cut through the noise like a metronome of defiance. Her four-star uniform gleamed beneath the flood of stage lights, the medals at her chest catching in gold and silver flashes. It was not vanity. It was proof. Every step she took carried the weight of years no one in this room could erase. The air shifted. At first, no one noticed. The band played. The officers clapped for David's carefully crafted speech. The families smiled and whispered in pride. But then, like the first ripple in a still pond, the silence began. One young lieutenant turned his head toward the aisle, his eyes widening as the figure came into view. He blinked, nudged the man beside him, and the whisper began. Liz's mind wandered for a fleeting moment, back to Afghanistan, the dust storm that had blinded them all, the chaos of gunfire in the dark, the silence that followed after the blast. She remembered dragging one man after another to cover, blood running into her eyes, the weight of her rifle feeling like stone. She hadn't shouted, hadn't called for help. She had worked in silence, carrying men twice her size out of the fire while the world thought she had already fallen. That silence had saved her platoon. And now, silence became her blade again. Sam Carter trailed 2 steps behind, his shoulders tense, scanning the crowd with the trained vigilance of a man who knew danger could erupt from pride as easily as from bullets. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was a shield, invisible but solid, a reminder that Liz was not entirely alone in this fight. From the audience, Kate O'Neill's eyes met Liz's. She did not rise, did not speak, but her gaze carried something stronger than applause. Faith. The kind of quiet strength that steadied hands and anchored hearts. For Liz, that was enough. Each step forward made the hall heavier. The applause faltered. The rhythm of David's speech broke as murmurs passed from row to row. The name moved like electricity, whispered with awe and disbelief. That's General Harrington. The words grew, multiplied, feeding on one another until the entire auditorium was buzzing, the ceremony shifting under the weight of her presence. Liz's jaw was set, her eyes straight ahead. She did not glance at the whispering crowd, did not falter when she saw the recognition in their faces. She walked as if every inch of the floor had been laid for her alone, as if no exclusion list could alter the fact that she belonged. On the stage, David stiffened. He gripped the podium too tightly, his knuckles pale, his smile frozen in place. The script in his hand shook imperceptibly, his rehearsed authority slipping. His carefully drawn lines about courage, honor, and independence suddenly rang false, even to his own ears. Liz did not need to speak. Her silence screamed louder than words. It reminded every person in the room of her record, of the stories they had all heard, but perhaps chosen to forget the rescues, the commands, the impossible odds she had overcome. The whispers grew louder, until the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting. David's eyes finally locked with hers. For the first time in years, he saw her not as the older sister he resented, not as the shadow he had tried to escape, but as the immovable truth he could not erase. His hand trembled. The neat paper slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the ground. The spotlight caught Liz's face as she reached the edge of the altar, her gaze steady, unwavering. David stood still, his speech slip falling from his hand. The entire unit turns its head, standing at attention when it sees Liz, but David tries to appear calm. The sound of boots shifting against the polished floor came like a wave through the hall. One by one, the officers who had been seated rose instinctively, as if responding to an invisible command. It wasn't protocol, not part of the ceremony, but when a four-star general entered, even one not announced training and instinct demanded respect. Rows of young soldiers stiffened, their uniforms crisp, their eyes locked on the tall figure moving slowly down the aisle. The light from above fell directly on Liz, and for a moment, the entire great hall seemed rearranged. The center no longer David at the podium, but the woman striding forward with steady grace. She walked with no rush, her chin high, each medal at her chest gleaming like hard-earned proof. The whispers returned, urgent and layered, rippling through families and officers alike. That's General Harrington. She wasn't on the list. She shouldn't even be here. The uncertainty only amplified the gravity of her presence. Liz didn't look left or right. She moved like the aisle was hers alone, the light deliberately marking her as someone impossible to ignore. From the stage, David forced his shoulders square, his jaw tight. He tried to keep his composure, but the slight quiver at the corner of his mouth betrayed him. His eyes darted briefly to the side, where General Denton leaned forward in his seat, his expression sharp, cold, calculating. Denton's voice reached him in a low hiss. "Don't let her steal the show." The words dug into David, but they sounded less like guidance and more like an order. Liz reached the front row and stopped. She didn't hesitate. She pulled back a chair, its metal legs screeching lightly against the floor, and she sat down with deliberate calm. She didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for acknowledgement. She claimed her place. The silence that followed was louder than applause, stretching across the hall like a taut string. Somewhere in the audience, a young lieutenant barely out of the academy watched her with wide eyes. He had studied her campaigns, read about her leadership, heard the stories whispered in training. Seeing her there, so unshaken despite being erased from the guest list, carved an impression deeper than any manual could. This wasn't just presence. This was power. David's throat tightened. He picked up his speech again, but the words faltered. No one leaned forward to hear him anymore. All eyes had drifted. He cleared his throat, forced a smile, but the tension had already shifted. Liz hadn't spoken a word, yet the hall obeyed her silence. She lifted her gaze and fixed it on him. Across the distance, the connection snapped like steel wire pulled taut. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. Her stare was steady, cool, resolute. For David, it was suffocating. For the audience, it was a confrontation without words, sharper than any rebuke. The air was heavy with it, an entire room balanced on a silence that Liz herself controlled. For the first time since the ceremony began, David was not the center. She was, and he knew it. The master of ceremonies, nervous under the tension, glanced back and forth between them. His voice cracked slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Then, perhaps guided by instinct or desperation to break the silence, he made the announcement that would change the rhythm of the room entirely. "General Elizabeth Harrington," he said, his words carrying over the hushed audience. "Would you care to share a few words with us today?" The hall froze. Liz's eyes never left David's. The host suddenly invited Liz to speak. Liz steps up to the podium to deliver her speech. The entire hall holds its breath. The sound of her boots against the polished floor echoed like a drumbeat. Every officer, every cadet, every family member seemed to inhale at once and then forget how to exhale. The air in the great hall thickened with anticipation, as though the very walls were waiting to hear what she might say. She did not rush. She moved as if she belonged there, as if the podium had always been meant for her. Her medals glimmered under the stage lights, reminders of battles survived and victories earned, evidence carved in sweat and blood that no bureaucrat or rival could erase. She rested her hands on the podium, straightened her back, and let her gaze sweep the audience. The silence was absolute. When she spoke, her voice carried like steel wrapped in velvet. "Ladies and gentlemen, comrades in arms, I thank you for your service. This day is meant to honor commitment, loyalty, and the unshakable bond of those who wear the uniform." Her tone was calm, measured, but every syllable held weight, each word puncturing the arrogance that had filled the hall moments earlier. David sat at his chair, his jaw tight, his knuckles whitening around his folded notes. His carefully rehearsed spotlight was dissolving into shadows, and he knew it. Liz didn't look directly at him yet, but her presence was consuming him, making his seat feel like a furnace. Denton sat stone-faced, his stare fixed forward, calculating but silent. Liz continued, her voice swelling with conviction. "In our line of duty, honors and ranks are symbols, yes, but empty symbols, if not carried with truth. Justice and honor cannot be erased, not by a list, not by omission, not by the silence of those who fear. They exist because we live them, because we bleed for them, because we refuse to surrender them." A murmur rippled through the audience agreement. Admiration, awe. Young officers straightened in their seats, as if inspired by the authority in her words. Veterans blinked hard, recognizing the echo of hard-earned truths. She paused, letting the silence deepen. Her eyes then turned toward David, sharp and unyielding. For the first time she pinned him directly, and the old memory came flooding back the boy in Quantico, his teeth gritted, whispering, "One day you will have to bow to me." That echo returned now, but inverted, transformed into something far heavier. Her words cut through the stillness. "Colonel Harrington, it is your duty to salute your superiors." The sentence fell like a hammer. For a heartbeat, no one moved. David's face stiffened, color draining, as if she had struck him. His chest rose and fell too quickly, and his fingers twitched at his side. The audience turned, every eye watching, waiting. The weight of tradition, of protocol, of military law, pressed on him with suffocating force. For 3 long seconds he stood frozen, fighting humiliation, his pride clawing at his throat. But he knew there was no escape. Slowly, his hand lifted. The movement was mechanical at first, stiff, reluctant, but once raised, the salute was undeniable, crisp and visible to every soul in the hall. For the first time in his life, David Harrington saluted his sister, not as family, but as a subordinate to his superior. The room erupted. Applause thundered. Shouts rang out, boots stamped in admiration. The hall seemed to shake under the roar. Liz did not smile, did not revel. She simply inclined her head, acknowledging the salute with dignity, her gaze steady as stone. For her, it was not victory, it was justice. In the front row, Richard Harrington's eyes glistened, though his face remained composed. Pride and sorrow battled quietly inside him. The image of his children, one saluting, one receiving it, was both triumph and tragedy. Liz held her ground as the storm of voices swirled around her. She did not need to say more. The truth had been witnessed, the balance of power displayed for all. And yet, not everyone celebrated. Amid the clamor, Denton leaned closer to David, his lips curling into something bitter and venomous. His whisper was a blade. "The game is not over yet." The words sank like poison into the air, a reminder that this battle was only the beginning. The applause fades, and a press leak spreads whispers. General Harrington staged her brother's ceremony for attention. The roar that had filled the great hall only moments before was already being twisted into something smaller, uglier. A shift rippled through the air. Reporters who had been content to scribble in their notepads now lifted their heads, phones buzzing, eyes glinting with the scent of scandal. Somewhere behind the curtains, the story had already been planted. It spread with the speed of wildfire. General Harrington hijacks her brother's promotion. Liz felt it before she heard it, the tightening in the room, the murmurs turning sharp, the shift in posture among those around her. Denton's shadow was there too, a presence that didn't need words. His smirk from nights earlier seemed to hover in her memory, an omen that he was already moving his pieces on the board. She did not flinch, though inside her pulse ticked like a war drum. She had expected this. He was never going to let her victory stand unchallenged. The setting moved quickly to the press chamber adjacent to the hall. Floodlights snapped on, the seal of the United States Army hanging heavy above the podium. Reporters jostled for position, microphones thrust forward like bayonets. Liz walked in with measured steps, her uniform crisp, her expression composed. Behind her trailed Richard, silent and pale, carrying the gravity of an old soldier watching the battlefield change shape in ways he had never liked. "General Harrington!" a voice rose above the others. "Did you intend to disrupt your brother's ceremony?" Another followed. "Was this stunt a way to steal attention?" And then another. "How do you respond to claims you disrespected military protocol?" Liz stood still, her gaze moving calmly across the crowd, as though the storm of questions were nothing more than static. But before she could answer, Marcus Denton stepped forward from the shadows with a smile that could have been carved from granite. He raised his hand, commanding silence with the ease of one who had played this game too long. "This is not complicated," Denton began, his voice booming with false patience. "What you all witnessed today was not a celebration of rank, but a spectacle. The promotion of Colonel David Harrington should have been about him and his men. Instead, certain individuals sought to make it about themselves." His eyes flickered toward Liz, sharp and cold, a hunger for the spotlight, dressed up as honor. The words landed hard, and the murmurs grew. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked like gunfire. Liz felt the sting of the accusation. Not for herself, she had learned to live with slander long ago, but for the manipulation, the rewriting of truth in real time. She caught sight of David across the chamber, his shoulders stiff, his lips pressed tight. His silence spoke volumes. He neither defended her nor opposed Denton outright. He stood trapped in the web, the younger brother who had always feared being swallowed by her shadow, now unwilling to step into the light to save her. Liz let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, almost unbearable. Then, when the moment was ripe, she stepped closer to the microphones. Her tone was not raised, not sharp, but clear and deliberate. "The truth is louder than whispers." The chamber stilled. Her words cut through the tension like a blade through cloth. For a heartbeat, even the reporters froze, pens hovering in midair. Then the noise returned, questions shouted, demands for clarification. But the phrase lingered, stronger than the accusations, echoing in ears that wanted something real to hold on to. Denton's jaw shifted just barely. He had not expected her to remain this composed, to throw back his weapon without raising her voice. He leaned back, adjusting his sleeve as though to mask irritation. To the public eye, he seemed unfazed, but inside the calculation had already begun again. Liz stepped back, the glare of the lights casting long shadows across her face. She would not fight them in the mud of rumors. Not yet. But she also knew she could not rely on silence alone, not when the game was being fought with words and headlines as much as medals and salutes. From the edge of the crowd, Kate O'Neill slipped forward with the quiet precision of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. She pressed a sealed folder into Liz's hands, her voice low but firm. "It's time." The weight of the folder settled like a weapon in Liz's grasp. Inside, she knew, was the piece Denton had not accounted for, the counterstrike she had been holding in reserve. She closed her fingers around it, her eyes meeting Kate's for a brief, steady instant. The room continued to buzz with questions, but for Liz, the noise fell away. What mattered now was not their whispers, not Denton's smirk, not David's silence. What mattered was that the truth had finally been given form, ink, and paper, waiting to cut through the lies. And tomorrow, she would use it. Inside a closed conference room, Liz confronts David and Denton directly. The door shut with a heavy click, sealing them inside. The air in the Fort Liberty strategy room was colder than the hall outside, the dim light casting sharp angles across walls lined with maps and battle insignia. It felt like a war council, But the battle now was not against foreign enemies, it was against betrayal within blood and uniform. Liz stood tall at the head of the table. The folder Kate had pressed into her hands now spread open like an arsenal of weapons. David slouched slightly in his chair, trying to project calm but betraying himself in the twitch of his jaw, the restless tapping of his fingers against polished wood. Denton, by contrast, leaned back with practiced ease, his eyes narrowed into an expression of control, the mask of a man who thought he had weathered storms far worse than this. Kate remained at Liz's side, arms crossed, her gaze steady as stone. Behind them, Sam Carter stepped forward, his presence a silent bulwark, clutching another folder that seemed to hum with weight. Liz's voice cut into the silence. Before this goes further into rumor and spectacle, let's speak plainly. You wanted to erase me. And here, she tapped the papers, her words measured, deliberate, is the proof. The first page slid across the table with a dry scrape. An email printed in black and white, Denton's words sharp as a blade. Today is not your sister's day. Cut her off the list. She must not exist in that room. The damning line hung in the air as if the ink itself carried poison. David's face tightened, color rising to his cheeks. He reached for the page, reading it twice, his lips moving soundlessly. Denton chuckled, low and dismissive. Do you think a few emails will undo a career? Words taken out of context, whispers passed along. This is nothing. Liz did not move. Her stare was level, unwavering. Context? She gestured to Sam, who stepped forward, laying another document down with precision. This isn't hearsay. This is a signed memo. Your signature, General Denton. Your instructions to remove me from official lists, filed under the guise of protocol. The room tightened around the evidence. Denton's smirk faltered for the briefest second, then returned, thinner now, brittle at the edges. David's hand shook as he traced his eyes over the memo. His breath grew shallow, his throat catching on every word. The silence was unbearable until his voice cracked through it. You told me this was for honor. His words trembled, fragile with years of denial. He lifted his eyes to Denton, wide and wounded. But it was for you. The room seemed to stop. Richard Harrington's lessons, Liz's sacrifices, all their history condensed into that one realization spilling from David's mouth. His shoulders slumped, the fight drained, the weight of his choices finally visible on his face. Kate exhaled quietly, her lips tightening with restrained triumph. Sam's jaw clenched, his eyes locked on Denton as though waiting for the older man to flinch, to lash out. Liz said nothing, her silence was heavier than accusation, her presence the embodiment of vindication. Denton straightened, his mask cracking into something harsher, the smirk twisted into a snarl, his voice dropping low, venomous. Without me, this family falls apart. The words struck like a curse, reverberating off the steel walls of the strategy room. For the first time, Denton was no longer the puppeteer in control, but the desperate man revealing his hand too late. The silence that followed was heavier than the evidence itself, a silence that promised the war was shifting, that the empire Denton had built on manipulation was crumbling under the weight of truth. In the Harrington estate, the evening settled like a heavy shroud. The fading light slanted through tall windows, spilling across polished wood, and the silent ranks of family portraits staring down from the walls. Generations of Harrington officers looked on faces painted in oil, uniforms stiff with pride, an ancestral gallery of judgment. Tonight, those eyes seemed fixed, demanding. Richard Harrington stood at the center of the parlor, his cane planted firmly on the rug, his shoulders squared despite the years bending his frame. His voice carried the weight of decades, sharp enough to cut through the silence. What have you done to your mother's name? The words echoed off the walls, louder than the crackling fire, louder than the evening cicadas outside. Liz sat upright on the edge of the sofa, her uniform crisp, her medals gleaming faintly in the amber glow. She felt no pride in their shine tonight. She felt the ache of betrayal etched deep into her bones, though her face betrayed none of it. David lingered by the mantel, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shadow long and broken against the family portraits. He looked like a boy again, cornered after a failed test, the weight of Richard's stare reducing him to something smaller than the colonel's rank on his shoulders. Richard's eyes, hard as flint, shifted from one child to the other. His voice trembled not with weakness, but with restrained fury. I built this name on sacrifice. Your mother carried it through grace. And you, his gaze pinned David like a bayonet. You've sullied it with jealousy and deceit. Liz reached into the folder she had carried back from Fort Liberty, her hands steady, though her heart thudded like distant drums. She unfolded a single page, its edges yellowed, handwriting familiar and tender. She laid it on the table between them, her voice softer than her father's but no less resolute. She knew this day might come. She left us her words to guide us. The letter trembled slightly in the air as she read. Never let anyone take away your honor, not by rank, not by title, not even by blood. Our name only lives if it is carried with truth. The silence that followed was suffocating. David's eyes fixed on the letter, his throat working as though each word clawed its way down into him. Memories unspooled his mother's gentle hand on his shoulder, her pride when Liz returned decorated from battle. The sting of knowing that pride had rarely turned toward him. His jaw clenched, his voice cracking when he finally spoke. I let it happen. I let him. His eyes flickered with Denton's shadow, guilt burning in his chest. I let jealousy blind me. Richard's cane struck the floor, the sound like a gavel-pounding judgment. His voice thundered, shaking even the portraits on the walls. You may wear the rank, David, but today you've been outranked by honor. The words landed like a final sentence. David staggered back a step, the weight of them heavier than the oak beams above. His breath shuddered, and his composure crumbled. Shoulders collapsing inward, he pressed a trembling hand to his face, the uniform suddenly too heavy, the colonel's insignia on his chest nothing but metal mocking him. His voice, ragged and broken, slipped through his fingers as he whispered the only plea left in him. Is there any way back? The fire popped, sending sparks upward, but the room stayed frozen. Liz's eyes softened, torn between the fury of betrayal and the faint glimmer of a sister's ache. Richard's stare remained unflinching, as though the verdict was still unfolding. Above them, their mother's portrait seemed to glow faintly in the fading light, her painted smile quiet, eternal, watching as her family stood on the edge of fracture or redemption. The tribunal chamber at Fort Liberty was brimming with anticipation. Rows of officers in uniform filled the benches, their medals catching the bright lights above. Cadets sat stiffly in the back, eyes wide as though witnessing a lesson that no textbook could teach. The press lined the walls, cameras clicking, pens scratching. A hush fell when the doors opened and General Marcus Denton strode inside, his steps deliberate, his head high, his chest puffed with the old confidence of a man who had survived decades of battles both on the field and in the halls of politics. He adjusted his uniform as though each button and medal were armor. His smirk lingered as he took his place before the tribunal table, whispering to himself that no storm could unseat him. The echo of his words from weeks ago seemed to follow him into the chamber. Tomorrow, she won't even exist in that room. Liz Harrington sat poised at the opposing table, her posture as rigid as steel but her eyes calm, unreadable. Richard Harrington, though aged and weary, sat behind his daughter, his silent presence lending a gravity heavier than any word. David sat beside him, face pale, stripped of arrogance, every line in his body carrying the shame of his missteps. Kate O'Neill and Sam Carter flanked Liz, both with thick folders in front of them, the quiet promise of truth, ready to be revealed. The gavel struck, and the presiding officer's voice rang out, calling the hearing to order. Denton wasted no time. He rose, his voice booming, thick with disdain. This is nothing but theatrics. General Harrington has paraded herself around as though she alone built this family, this legacy, this army. She is drunk on her own rank, and now she manipulates my protege to smear me. His hand sliced through the air, a gesture meant to command authority. A murmur rippled through the chamber, but it stilled when a young cadet, seated near the back, suddenly rose. His voice carried, clear and unwavering. I saw what happened. I heard the insults. General Harrington was mocked, denied, erased from the list because you, sir, ordered it. The cadet's words cut through Denton's booming tone like a blade. The room shifted, all eyes turning toward the boy, whose courage made the silence ring louder than any cheer. Denton scoffed, turning red. A cadet's word against a general's? Pathetic. But his sneer faltered when Kate stood, her voice measured. It isn't just his word. It's this. She slid a folder onto the tribunal table, spreading its pages with careful precision. Printed emails, directives bearing Denton's signature, his orders to undermine Liz, his encouragement of David's jealousy, his scheme to remove her name. Sam followed, producing a memo signed under Denton's authority. detailing his manipulations with surgical clarity. He made sure she was cut from the guest list, not for the good of the army, but for his personal vendetta. Sam's voice was calm, but his gaze locked on Denton with unwavering fire. Denton's mouth opened, but no defense came. The evidence lay bare, undeniable, ink and words betraying the man who once thought himself untouchable. His hands trembled as he grabbed the table edge, but the tribunal president's voice thundered over him. General Marcus Denton, your conduct is unbecoming of your station. You have conspired to tarnish honor, manipulate ranks, and disgrace this institution. Effective immediately, you are stripped of all advisory roles, and your standing in this service is revoked. The room erupted not in applause, but in a heavy hum of whispers, the kind that told of downfall, the spreading of disgrace. Denton's face drained of color, his knees buckled slightly, and for the first time he looked smaller than the uniform he wore, as though the cloth itself rejected him. He had weathered countless storms, but this one drowned him in the tide of truth. As guards moved forward to escort him, reporters surged like a breaking wave. Cameras flashed, voices collided, pens scratched furiously. Denton's collapse had shaken the institution, and the world would not miss a detail. In the chaos, one question rang out louder than the others, shouted from the throng of journalists. "General Harrington, what's next for your family?" The question lingered in the chamber like a gauntlet thrown, all eyes snapping to Liz, as Denton's shadow was dragged away into irrelevance. The parade ground at West Point stretched wide beneath a crisp May sky, banners snapping in the spring wind. Rows of cadets stood immaculate in gray and white, boots polished to mirrors, rifles gleaming in the sun. Their eyes fixed forward, yet a current of excitement rippled through the formation. This was no ordinary day. This was the day General Elizabeth Harrington would speak. Weeks had passed since the storm at Fort Liberty, weeks in which truth had stripped away deception, and the dust of disgrace had finally settled. Now, the Academy had summoned her not as a figure in scandal, but as a voice of honor. Liz walked across the broad platform, her 4 stars shining against the dark uniform. The cadence of the military band faded to silence, leaving only the sound of flags whipping against the breeze. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one resonating with the weight of memory. Every humiliation, every betrayal, every battle, fought not just with bullets, but with words, silence, and will. She reached the podium, pausing, letting the stillness grow until the cadets held their breath, as if awaiting orders on the eve of combat. Her voice rang firm, low, but steady. "Rank can be worn," she began, "but honor must be lived." The words cut clean through the air, each syllable finding its mark. She let her gaze sweep over the sea of faces, young men and women with futures unscarred but already bound to the same code that had both lifted and wounded her. Titles fade, stars tarnish, but honor will outlast us all. It is the measure of a soldier, the memory we leave behind when the uniforms are folded and the bugle plays its last. From the second row, Richard Harrington watched, his aging frame straightened as though 30 years had fallen away. Pride flickered in his stern eyes, softened only by the ghost of his late wife whose voice still echoed through the family. "Never let them strip your honor," the line whispered in Liz's mind as she steadied her breath. Among the crowd, David stood. He had been given leave to attend, not in uniform, but in plain attire, stripped of pomp, his once proud shoulders heavy with shame. He listened, head bowed, every word sinking into the hollow he had carved for himself. Yet, when Liz paused, when her speech rose to its crest, it is not the applause, nor the salutes, nor the records in books that give a life meaning. It is whether you held the line of truth when it mattered most. David raised his head. The movement was small, hesitant, but undeniable. His right hand rose to his brow, a salute not forced, not staged, not commanded by ceremony, but drawn from something deeper. The broken acknowledgement of a brother who had lost his way and finally saw the light he had tried so long to snuff out. The gesture sent a wave through the cadets, their boots clattering as they joined in unison. A field of salutes cast toward the woman who had carried scars heavier than medals. Richard, eyes damp though his face remained firm, lifted his hand as well. Father and son aligned, not in words, but in one action, saluting the woman who had been betrayed, silenced, mocked, yet had risen to stand unbroken. Liz held the gaze of her brother for one moment longer, then returned the salute with calm, unshaken dignity. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating, only the quiet victory of one who had outlasted the storm. The applause roared like thunder as she stepped back from the podium. Yet Liz did not linger in the glory. She turned, her boots striking the wooden stage, her gaze fixed forward. As she descended the steps, the cadets whispered, voices raw with awe, with belief. One young voice, not louder than a breath, carried enough to catch the spring wind. One day, I'll serve under her. Liz allowed the faintest smile, her stride never faltering. The flags cracked above, sunlight blazing against the gold of her insignia, and in that moment, the circle was complete. Betrayal had met exposure, injustice had yielded to truth, and honor had endured. The long struggle that began with betrayal closed on a stage of honor, where truth had silenced deceit and dignity was restored. Justice, though delayed, struck with undeniable force, reminding that when courage refuses to bend, the tide always turns against those who thrive on manipulation. Like a flame breaking through the darkest night, honor proved stronger than ambition, and the scars of injustice became the mark of resilience. No wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. If this story touched you, please like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts. Comment 1 if you felt the same wound in victory, or 2 if you believe the reckoning was still not enough.